edition of BM Talks with me, Helen Thomas, CEO and founder of Blonde Money. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Alex Patelis. Most recently, he served as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece from 2019 to 2024. And he's done a great many things prior to that, having worked in banking. He also received a doctorate studying under Ben Bernanke at Princeton. And I'm delighted to say he helped me when I started my first ever job out in financial markets at Merrill Lynch almost a quarter of a century ago. So hello, Alex, and welcome. It's good to see you again.
Oh, Helen, great to see you too. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I've rather aged us both there, I'm afraid, but that's how it goes because there's
Not at all.
a lot that has happened in that period and is a lot that is relevant to where we are today. So look, just going back, because 10 years ago to now, on the 5th of July, 2015, the Greek people voted no in a key referendum on the bailout of Greece. Now, at the time, everybody thought this was the end of Greece. And I think you would agree now that few will expect where we are today, Greece would still be in the euro, borrowing at lower costs than Italy, running a primary budget surplus and back to investment grade. So let's start by telling us what happened.
Let me just start by saying that when Helen reached out to do this podcast, I said to her, it is the decade anniversary of the referendum. You could not get a better timing than this one. And I distinctly remember this day 10 years ago, standing in Syntagma Square, the main square of Athens, chanting in favor of the yes vote and staying in the euro. The yes vote was crushed, 62-38. And yet, Tsipras, the prime minister, did what they call a somersault and ended up agreeing to an even stricter third bailout that basically cost another 100 billion. And so today we're standing here, and as you mentioned, Greece is trading below Italy. Yields are below the Italian ones, approaching Spain, and Greece had a primary surplus of 4.8% last year, which is completely insane and, was totally unexpected. And the debt has fallen more than anywhere else. So,
Actually, what is, Alex, sorry to interrupt, what is the debt to GDP ratio now?
It's falling at around 150%, and it's below the 2012 level, and it's had the biggest decline of any country in the world over the past 4 years. And I'll talk about this later. But I want to start by making the obvious point, which is that the Greek story is a story of hope and optimism, and that whenever things look really bad, humans have very big difficulty grasping big trends and looking at the big picture. And if you try to think of how the world will be in 10 years, it's actually extremely difficult to forecast that. Things don't always go bad. They turn and they go better. And I think it's a story also of human perseverance, that humanity endures a lot more than people realize. And I say this because there's a lot of grand pronouncements that people always make about how the world's coming to an end. There's a disaster, blah, blah, blah. And it isn't. The humans, fight back. Now, there were a bunch of economists that also gave a bunch of advice. I remember Krugman and Stiglitz that said you need to devalue, blah, 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 blah. We all remember that. I think this is another interesting point. It's that Greece did not devalue, obviously, it kept the euro. Other countries did devalue, like Argentina or Turkey, and they're not in a better state today than they were back then. And amazingly, I would say the most amazing thing about the whole thing is that the openness of the Greek economy basically doubled or tripled. So exports as percent of GDP went from 20% to about 50% today.
Wow.
Over the past 10, 15 years. Whereas, for example, Argentina remains a relatively closed economy, despite the fact that it's had all kinds of currency arrangements, blah, blah, blah. And the main lesson from that is simply that investment requires stability. And stability means political stability, but it also means institutional stability. This might seem like a very obvious point, but it's not the case in many countries. And investors are drawn to places that are stable, that are predictable. And once you have that as your base, then of course you could start talking about what kind of rules are there in place, etc. But you need the stability to start.
Okay. Wow. Okay, there's so many things to talk about. By the way, can I say thank you for striking an optimistic tone because so much of what we hear these days is not, and we do need to focus on that, not just for our souls, but also for our brains, because when you're thinking about the risks out there, you have to look at the whole distribution, not just the negatives that people focus on. Um, okay, so now you have just been serving as the chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about him for those 5 years from 2019 to 2024. What do you think were the main ingredients of this recovery? And I should say, I know you are also writing a book on this, which I believe will be out in Greek later this year with a potential English translation to come. Yeah, so what has actually happened in Greece? What are the changes that took place?
So I'll start by answering sort of a first question was how did I end up there? And the answer is when the prime minister was leader of the opposition, I literally received an email one day from him saying, "Hey, I've read some of your research reports. Would you like to meet up?" And I was completely taken aback and completely shocked. I thought it was spam at the beginning
What, you
because
had no connection?
nope, nope,
Wow.
none whatsoever, no politics, nothing, nothing. And I went and met him, and then I was blown away second time because he knew a lot of economic stuff. But so to answer your question, the first thing that's very important is actually to reach out to so-called specialists.
Mm.
I know it's a very it's not a trendy word to use anymore, but a prime minister or leader or whatever has the opportunity to ask many people to help them, and people will gladly do so. And a lot of people don't use that power. So I met up with him, and then whatever, we struck a
Actually,
good,
sorry, Alex. Sorry, I'm going to ask one
yeah,
very quick question there because um, you're saying you had no. I mean, I guess did you have any partisanship at all? I mean, no. So that in
no,
itself is maybe an interesting perspective for some of the politicians and political world. That
yeah.
yeah, when they
So
look at
so
the experts.
So in 2019, when the New Democracy, it's the party currently in power, came to power, a lot of people did not trust Greece and did
Mm,
not trust Greece because of all the problems from before. And New Democracy was one of the political parties that ruled Greece for a long period of time. So the question always was, guys, how are you going to fix it if you were part of the system that led to the crisis? And one answer was, where we also have technocrats in government. And
mm,
there's always a big debate. How much does a government need to be political and how much technocratic? In the United States, they've sort of resolved this issue a long time ago, and it's fairly standard for people from the private sector to serve in government
mm.
for a period of time. And I think there is something to be said to this mixed model because you do need politicians because we do have a democracy, and at the end of the day, people need to be elected. But at the same time, people from outside the political system, they bring their expertise and they also bring a different perspective. As we were preparing, Prime Minister said, "Oh, you've got to prepare a deck, obviously to show to people about what our economic policy would be." Helen is smiling. And I did that, and then he interrupted me and he said, "No, I'd like you to put a triangle in the deck." And I said, "What do you mean?" And this is our economic philosophy. So, to answer your question, it was a triangle, three sides. The first side was fiscal stability and lower taxes. So obviously Greece was indebted, so you need to have your books in order, and at the same time try to focus on lowering taxes, particularly on capital and labor, because that will spur growth, as opposed to the spending side. We focus a lot on the tax side. Secondarily, the banking system was a mess, so it was very obvious, I guess, that you got to fix the banking system. And the NPEs went down from about half the loan book down to 3% today. And it's a long story, but without a healthy financial system, you cannot have economic growth. And thirdly, of course, was reforms. And here you just need to change the trend growth of the economy. And I would say, if you ask the average person on the street in Greece, what was the one reform that the government got right? It's digitization. A
Mm.
lot of stuff is digitized now. We have all kinds of apps on our phone,
Mm.
an app with your driver's license and your ID and your social security number. And then we have an app on your tag for for inland revenue where you can see all what you've paid, what you owe, blah, blah, blah. And then we have a health app where you can find all your examination results from the past, the prescriptions that the doctors have written for you. And we have a My Coast app where you can go and zoom in on beaches and find if they have illegal sunbeds on them and things like that. So,
Wow.
yeah, this whole digitization thing was very important, not only because it's fun, but also because it's fair that everyone feels that they have the same access to public services, and it goes a long way in repairing the trust between the electorate and government. A lot of other stuff I can talk about. Green transition. I mean, Greece has sun and wind, obviously, and it was ridiculous that we were not, in the forefront of this.
Mm.
And then we did some stuff that I know is not trendy in the UK anymore, but non-doms, family offices, trying to attract, pensioners and workers from abroad, and trying to attract capital altogether, just saying that you're open for business. And there's, a lot of stuff. And I would say at the center of all of this was governance, and as I mentioned before, drawing on expertise of various people.
Wow. Okay. So obviously there was a mandate for this when New Democracy came in, and well, the things you described, was that the policy platform that they put out there in their manifesto, effectively, or did it
Yes,
grow over
but
time?
yeah, but what's interesting is, voters are always very suspicious, and they're not actually sure that, that you're actually going to implement the
Yeah,
platform that you have.
exactly.
And in 2019, there was also another theory in Greece that the Greeks lie and the politicians lie, and also that the established parties cannot get you out of this. And there was a view also that only, because the government from 2015 to 2019, the Tsipras government, was a left-wing government that basically promised to not apply any of the rules, and ended up applying, the memoranda in the strictest of terms. So there was a lot of cynicism amongst the electorate
Of
that
course.
people say one
Yeah.
thing, and when they come to power, they do the other. I would say very important was the fact that the government acted very quickly when it came to power. And I think that's another lesson a lot of times and we can see this. I'll give you an opposite example. Donald Trump in the United States, no one can accuse him of not having said what he was going to do.
Yeah.
But people didn't believe it. So he said, I'm going to cut immigration. He said, I'm going to do tariffs. And he said, I'm going to cut taxes. And he has done that very quickly in his first months in office. And so he has credibility with the electorate that way. Now, if you don't want that, that's a different story. But he said what he's doing. Whereas the other governments, I'm not going to mention any in particular, that come to power and seem paralyzed at the beginning. And that's
Yes.
a very big mistake.
Yeah. Well, more broadly, then, talking about lessons that other countries could take from what happened in Greece. Let's specifically think of the over-indebted Western nations: UK, US, France, Italy, even. Yeah, what lessons can they draw from this? In terms of, you've mentioned that happened in the US. What about some of these other countries?
Yeah, so Greece, as I mentioned before, had its biggest decline in debt to GDP of any country in the world. Now, inflation obviously helped, but inflation has been more or less the same in all countries in the world. I would say there's the obvious one, which is that you need to somehow put your government books in order. You cannot run a large budget deficit, and expect debt to be stable. That's just not going to happen. But the main, debt to GDP is as much about GDP as it is about debt. There's a
Yeah.
denominator and the numerator, and the denominator needs to grow. So you need to have reforms to accelerate trend growth in your economy. And if you don't do that, it's not going to work. So from 2015 to 2019, Greece ran 4% primary surpluses, and debt to GDP didn't move at all. And that's because the growth was weak. So you need reforms. You also need to communicate to markets what your plan is. It needs to be a very clear plan, because, investment professionals, as you know, don't have time to spend paying attention to all the minutiae.
No.
And you need to stick to your plan, whatever it is, one, two, three, and stick to it. And once you do that, then it becomes much easier to communicate later if you want to do something else because you've developed some credibility and people trust you that you're going to do that. I think the worst thing that can happen is you say one thing and you do the opposite, or you say too many things and people don't really know what your plan is.
Can
And
we
so, yeah.
can we talk about the UK?
Uh,
Because
uh,
hearing what you're saying, I would imagine a lot of UK-based listeners would think, "Wow, that sounds great! What this government came in 2019 to do in Greece. How on earth did they manage that?" With, as you say, the debt to GDP ratio hadn't really budged, and still a lot of debt out there, and there was still a lot of question marks about Greece in 2019. So yeah, what happened? Or is there a difference in the economic circumstances? We were in a different inflation environment in 2019, of course. I mean, could a UK government come in and apply a similar platform, in your view?
Look, every country is different in the sense that the problems every country has are different. So the
Yeah.
UK is not as indebted as Greece. So there's no question about that. So that should not be the priority of a UK government. But I would say the broad principle applies in the sense that you need to have a platform on which you are elected and you need to implement that. So I'll give you a very simple example. So look, and again, I don't want to judge anybody or, I'm just making observations.
Yeah.
The successive Tory governments ran on a platform of controlling immigration. Now, whether you agree with that or not is one thing, but they didn't control it. But the reality is immigration shot up under successive Tory governments. So the government didn't deliver on what it was meant to, what it
Mm.
was elected to do. And I think it's really that simple.
Yeah.
And I would say the current administration in the UK that isn't entirely clear what its top priorities are, and I think that comes across a lot of times. And it's trying to do many things at the same time, without without having decided itself what is its main priority.
If I may, as someone outside of the country in October 2022, when of course there was the huge gilt sell-off and dramatic
Liz Truss
change.
moment.
Exactly. Synonymous in the whole world. What um what lessons do you think policymakers should draw from that? Now, because I ask you as someone who obviously understands markets and politics, and
So, I
actually,
mean,
yeah.
it's obvious that, the UK is obviously one of the most credible economies in the world with very long history and very strong institutions that have withstood the test of time.
Mm.
So any politician looking at what happened in October 22 will say that if this can happen to the UK, it can happen basically to anyone. And what is this? It's that if you, put across a plan that doesn't make sense, you will be punished by the markets. And the markets are, they can turn on a dime and turn against you. So the main lesson is, make sure you've thought about what you want to do. Having said that, maybe I'm being too optimistic. I don't know what, maybe this is going to be the theme of this podcast, but it happened very quickly, right?
Yeah.
So it was the wrong policy. The markets turned against it. The policy was reversed. End of story. So there was no permanent damage from it. And that is actually a strength of the UK, that the system reacted, the party itself, the everybody reacted against what was bad policy and mitigated the negative effects very quickly. Whereas in another country, that might not have happened. Maybe that policy would have continued for a few months before it came to an end. So I don't view that event necessarily as a negative event.
Mm.
It's sort of a optimistic thing that the UK is still a country that actually does things the right way. Because in life we all make mistakes. This is not the issue of making. It's what you do after you've made the mistakes and how do you fix it that differentiates people and countries.
And of course, in the UK, we have an independent central bank. I would like just a moment for you to reflect on, for Greece, of course, being part of the euro and under the monetary union, the ECB and the role of the ECB now hasn't been around as long as the Bank of England. But do you think in the end it helped Greek credibility that there was the
Absolutely,
ECB? Yeah.
absolutely. And so, had Greece not been part of the European Union and the euro, it would not be in the position it is today, in the sense that there's an anchor that ties it. The ECB and the SSM, the supervisory mechanism,
Mm.
were very important, not only in helping Greece overcome the problems in 2015 and afterwards, but also in reforming the banking system. So the insistence on corporate governance rules and the insistence on adequate capital is what changed the banks. And the banks today in Greece are actually accused for the opposite of what was the case before. Now they're accused of making too much money and having too many deposits. I don't know if you know this, but the
No.
yield on a Greek deposit, bank deposit today is lower than the yield on a Swiss bank deposits. So yeah,
Wow.
so because the banks have too many deposits and they don't need any more. So it's one of those, bizarre situations. But the corporate governance of the banks changed as well, the board of directors, the CEOs, etc., and that helped. And I would say, I don't know if you saw this, but yesterday, depending on when this podcast is released, there was a bid submitted by Euronext for the Athens Stock Exchange. And so what we're beginning to see is, well, we're seeing it already anyway, is that we've had the central banks merge in the euro area. We've had, banks being supervised in the same way. We are having stock markets being merged, and I believe eventually we will have the capital markets regulators merged in a similar fashion to what happened to the bank regulators. And the reality in the big picture is that the capital markets union in the euro area is proceeding and needs to accelerate, and it's to the benefit of the 27 countries.
Sounds like we almost have that Mario Draghi here and his competitiveness report, etc. I'm sure you love that. Actually, do you get hearing that? And that is quite astonishing what you said about Greek banks compared to Swiss banks. Do you get upset when Greece has become almost a byword for terrible instability and a nightmare? I mean, I see the Japanese Prime Minister, I think, even referred to this, and the Japanese Central Bank. People keep saying, "Oh my goodness, look at it compared to where Greece is." Well, Greece has had one hell of a turnaround. Does it upset you, or do you just think, "Oh, this is
No, I mean,
classic"?
during the crisis, some of the generalizations were very difficult to understand. But I think at the end of the day, the legacy of the crisis itself created a national trauma in the country, and it's
Mm.
probably and not just in Greece, right? In the whole of Southern Europe.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing now is that it's going to be very difficult for any government in this part of the world to ever run large deficits again or do completely unsustainable policies. And in that sense, it's what guarantees the safety and the prosperity of these countries for a period of time.
You
So
talk of trauma, by the way. What is the mood now amongst the Greek people about I guess you talk about trust and credibility. Is that, I mean, it's 5 years. It's not actually that long in a history of quite an unstable Greek political period. Have people bought in completely now? Is there?
there's the famous story of when Winston Churchill won the Second World War, he lost the election
Yeah,
because people focused on peace and they didn't want to talk about war.
yeah.
So in Greece, people recognize that the government managed to take the country out of the crisis, bring it back to investment grade, yada, 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 and now they're looking for the next step. And so people now observe that after all this long period of crisis, Greece is at the bottom. I mean, it's not at the top of the European Union. In various league tables, it's still a relatively poor country. And so the objective now is to converge to the middle of the European Union economically, politically, in every possible way. And that's the mandate of the government. So the electorate and people always look ahead, not behind, and they want a better life for themselves and their children. And so, unsurprisingly, some of the topics are the same around the world.
Mm.
So, what are the top, let's say, I don't know, three or four topics that any country and any government is facing. Number one, cost of living, that remains the global issue.
Yeah.
Number two, the health system. Surprisingly, no country in the world is happy with its health system. And number three, some form of immigration issue or something like that.
Mm.
Security dash immigration. Those are the main issues facing most governments, obviously in varying degrees depending on the severity of the issues, but they're very common across the world.
Yeah, and can we actually turn to Germany, which has had in its own turn a Zeitenwende, this turning of the eras into a real shift. I mean, there was already a Zeitenwende when the Ukraine war broke out, and they changed their views on defense, and now that has absolutely gone into overdrive with Merz and the changes to balanced budgets. I mean, it's astonishing, actually. I think we cannot actually overstate this change in Germany. Does this change the nature of Europe's monetary union? Were you surprised at what happened in the wake of that German election?
Um, I don't know if I was surprised, but yes, it is a very important event. It's a very important shift in policy. It's driven by many factors. As you mentioned, there's reality that defense spending needs to go up because we have Russian aggression and other issues around the world. There's the arrival of Merz, who's much more pragmatic and comes also from the private sector.
Mm.
And there's the economic performance of Germany that has been disappointing in recent years. I remember there was a long period of time when people would ask us, how can the Greek economy do well if the German economy is not doing well? And people don't ask that anymore because they take no. They take the German economy not doing well as a given. They consider it
Oh, I
now.
see.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they think it's like this is the natural state of affairs, which it isn't. It
yeah.
shouldn't be.
No.
But so it is an important, I would say it's not just the extra defense spending that's important out of Germany. It's also the fact that there's a lot of willingness by the new administration to work with other European countries to solve issues.
Mm.
It's a much more pragmatic administration. Now, I do want to have a note of caution as an economist, which I am, which is that defense spending is great because we all need national security, but it's not actually the most productive use of resources.
Yeah,
This is, and also it's easier said than done. It's
yeah.
it's not clear, how exactly how exact where that money will go. Is it going to be, national champions, European champions? Germany literally has no defense capability whatsoever. So how exactly will it build it? The details will matter. But yes, it's a good moment for the European Union, and I hope that the same focus is also placed on the other projects of the Draghi report, completing capital markets union, completing the single market, and the energy stuff, energy interdependence and everything else.
From a markets perspective, as someone who was in financial markets, with the supply of bunds, German bunds now uh, completely shifting. If they deliver everything they're promising, this is quite an order of magnitude change in German debt. Does that create? Are you concerned about stability issues when the so-called core eurozone economies, um, flooding the market with debt issuance at a time when there's an awful lot more debt issuance, or do you think that is overblown and it's just
I
it's a
mean,
good story?
Germany starting from a very low GDP point, so it can afford to do what it wants for a number of years, and ultimately have convergence, let's say, in the behavior of the core and the periphery countries, and this is why spreads continue to narrow, not just with Greece, but with most countries, and I think they will continue to narrow. Concern has to be always has to be in those countries that are starting from high debt levels and have large budget deficits. So the United States, France, those kinds of countries.
Interesting on France because not many people have talked about this, but there was another no confidence vote brought in their prime minister. It didn't really get reported because it failed, as in fact Le Pen's national rally did not want to back this. They did not want to topple the government. And you talk about France, you talk about the debt deficit dynamics could be challenging there. Um, what about the role of so-called populism or these more extreme parties, both on the right and the left? Because actually, if you look at that French example, there could have been quite a different outcome if the National Rally had chosen to try and destabilize this government once again. They could have done, causing a real headache for the French president. Um, yeah, Greece obviously has had its share of populists and effectively rejected them, in fact. So is there a lesson there for
So
customers?
I will define populism, because we have to start from that,
Yes.
of making grand promises, solving complex problems with simple solutions. So my favorite example is lose weight by eating chocolate. That's how I define populism. So a politician comes out and says, "Don't worry, all of you, you can lose weight. Just keep on eating chocolate." That's basically it. Of course, now with Ozempic, that might be the case, but anyway. So we have a bunch of political parties like that, as you mentioned, on the left and on the right. Greece went through this 2015. We got a government elected to solve all the problems without following the rules. It didn't happen. And it was forced to do the opposite. So the main problem that populists have is that when they come to power, they are faced with reality. And one lesson I have learned is that if you want to have a long political career, you actually do need to be able to solve the problems. If you don't solve them, you might get elected, but your career will end quickly, as Liz Truss found out. So being a populist, the best you can do is once you're in power, change strategy and go back to a more mainstream path. But there is, even in Greece, in Greece, there was this very big open debate, and there still is. Was it necessary for the country to go through this whole thing in order to reject it, as you said, and move forward? And there are people who believe that you need to go through it in
Mm,
order to reject it. I'm not so sure. I mean, Spain didn't elect a populist government. Remember Podemos, and they managed to do
mm,
perfectly fine. So, so to answer your question, there's going to be a continuous fight with populism in many countries. In some countries, populists will win and will be elected. They will fail when they're in power, and eventually we will go back to a more, let's say, normal government. And for investors, it's a difficult exercise because when the populists do come to power, it always costs in markets. Maybe not immediately, but over the medium term, it does cost. But as I said before, nothing lasts forever, and you get over every episode and you move on. And okay, there are exceptions. For example, Venezuela or Argentina were in a good position, and then they were not. But for most countries in the world, these things are pretty cyclical.
Can I just touch on Alexis Tsipras because it's I was actually talking to somebody in the UK about this recently, saying using the Greece as an example about how change can come around, but that this moment they were talking about the 10 years ago where there was this, and it was a very definitive referendum result, as you said at the beginning of this podcast. You said, and he presided over a complete about face, a complete U-turn, which is quite astonishing. And he remained in power. Now, I think with a reduced
Won the
majority
next election in
at the next
September
election.
15th.
Yeah. So what happened there? You're talking about breaking promises. I mean, he broke a massive promise.
Yeah, opinions differ about this. I'll tell you my personal opinion. When populists come to power, the electorate falls in love with them. It's an emotional
Mm,
relationship.
mm,
And they truly believe that this person, whoever it may be, will make their life better. And that they will lose weight eating chocolate. And at the beginning, when that doesn't happen, they're not ready to admit to themselves that they were wrong. In fact, even in hindsight, one of the most extraordinary statistics is that the people who voted no in the referendum have not regretted, broadly speaking, have not regretted their vote.
yeah.
So people become emotionally attached to the populist leader, and therefore it takes them a very long period of time before they admit to themselves that they made a mistake. In fact, they might never admit the mistake. So the leader remains popular for much longer than you might think. However, the opposite is also the case. Once the electorate decides that this was the wrong thing to do and that this leader betrayed them and
Mm.
that they actually gained weight by eating chocolate, then they, because it was such an emotional relationship, they turn against them in a much more emotional way.
Yeah.
And they never forgive. So Tsipras today, I don't know if you know this, but he's trying to make a comeback amazingly without having
Mm.
really regretted much of what happened. But it's very difficult for him because people always remember, the queues at the banks and the broken promises. So and you can see that example with many other populist leaders around the world that once they're gone because the same forces that brought them to power are the ones that quickly bury them. And maybe the opposite is also the case. Sometimes leaders that might seem dry and uncharismatic
Mm.
to pundits actually do develop a strong relationship with the electorate precisely because they are dry and uncharismatic, and and there's a trust that develops. I mean, my obvious example would be, Mark Carney won the election in Canada without being a charismatic political leader because the electorate actually wanted someone who would be capable to lead the country through a period of turmoil with the Trump administration, and they got a president that is actually very professional and
Yeah.
not your sort of typical politician.
Well, never won elected political office before, ever.
Never, yeah.
In fact, became prime minister without it. Of course, then did win his position in the subsequent election. Actually, one thing that has happened in some of these recent elections was the opposition party leader losing their seat. I'm thinking about
That's
Canada
right. And
and
Australia, right?
and
Yeah.
Australia, exactly. Do you have any thoughts on what's going on with that? I mean, that is really quite a shocking outcome.
Not my area of expertise, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay, you have to come back to us, a blonde money,
Yeah,
when we plow into
exactly.
the politics of this. Looking at the US, um, this is something actually. Now, you and I, we met in foreign exchange, and actually, when I started my career, there was a lot of worry about the twin deficits of America, and I see here we are, quarter of a century later,
Same point.
same point. So, what do you think? Is the demise of the US dollar over exaggerated?
I don't like using words like demise or anything. And it's not just because I worked in government. It's just that I mean, the dollar remains close to one of the strongest today. I mean, it's at close to one of the strongest level it's been in history. So
Yeah.
demise, would have to fall a lot from here. But as we know and we found out, currencies go up, currencies go down, and there are issues with currencies that currencies trend. And at the moment, I would think that the problem that the US dollar faces is simply the challenge, the real or not, it doesn't matter. The challenge that people are making on the institutional credibility of the United States. Now,
Yeah.
whether that's going to continue or not, I don't know. But when you have a president that openly challenges the central bank and threatens to install someone who's going to be more politically malleable, or when you have, uncertainty, the tariff situation was mostly about uncertainty, or you have a lot of confrontations. Obviously, that's not good for your currency. The starting point matters. The starting point always matters. So the dollar was starting from a point at which it was the strongest in a very long period of time, and the US stock market was starting from a point in which
Mm.
it had outperformed all the other stock markets for a very long period of time. So the question is, what is discounted always? What are markets taking as a given,
Mm.
and which way is this moving? And
Mm.
so if the Trump administration continues to challenge institutions, you will see the dollar to continue falling.
Yeah. And I mean, look, Scott Bessent, if I may just say, similar to yourself in that he worked in markets before
Mhm.
moving into government.
Just
If
kidding. Yeah.
if you if you could give him a piece of advice, I'm sure he's an avid listener.
I
But
don't
what would
like
you
giving,
say? You don't
I
like
don't,
advice.
I don't like giving pieces of advice to people because I don't feel like I did everything right. But I can tell you what I learned
Sure.
from my because obviously having worked in markets and then moving to a position in government, it's different. I would say that the main issue when you're in government or in politics for that matter is that obviously your objective is to address everybody in the country. And your policies will have an impact to every single person, and you are accountable to every single person. And that might not be something that we in markets are familiar with. We know very
Mm.
well. We can talk about the dollar, we can talk about, bond markets, etc. But can we talk about, for example, farming, or can we talk about, I don't know, other issues? So it's important to be able to listen to all the different constituents that you have, and also to be able to communicate to them in the same way. We have fragmented media today. We have
Mm.
social media. Nobody watches the same news.
Mm.
It's actually very difficult to communicate, and and you need to follow a strategy of appealing to many different parts of the electorate in many different ways. And one person wants to watch a TikTok video, another person wants to listen to you in the news, another
Mm.
person doesn't want to hear about you at all. Someone will
Yeah.
read your article in that you write in a serious newspapers. Other people just want to see your photo from the party you threw for your children or something. So it's a very complicated word, and you need to be attuned to the fact that when you're in government, you're no longer talking just to financial markets. And it's a very difficult transition for a lot of people to make.
Yeah, I was struck recently. There was a focus group in the UK on some Labour voters from 2024, and they characterized the struggles that they're top of their mind. You mentioned top of voters' minds, and it struck me, it stuck with me actually, what this voter said, because they said, it's hard at the moment. I can't even afford to have fish and chips on a Friday night. And it's these little that voter is talking about cost of living, is talking about treating themselves when things feel tough. And but in that little statement you have what is on a lot, what matters to people about their lives, and how they get fed up with the government. And there really is a government. Then if you're going to change things, you have to communicate it to that person who probably is switched off by now anyway and isn't that interested in what you're saying.
Empathy. There's the infamous clip of Rishi Sunak with the homeless person. I'm sure you remember that from the soup kitchen. Empathy.
Yeah.
That you have to. It's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of someone else.
Yeah.
But you have to make that effort, and you have to first show empathy, that you understand what the problem is before you propose a solution.
Yeah. And then, as you say, you have to communicate it and communicate consistently and deliver it. Because, as
And
you
then
said,
deliver it.
if you're not going to do that, then this trust is it's even shorter supply. Okay, well, we have to draw to a close, even though this is so useful, and you must translate your book into English because the Western world needs to hear. I mean, what is the book is going to be about? The lessons, is it not?
So the book is going to be how Greece got its mojo back, how it recovered its credibility internationally, and obviously how I experienced that over the past 5 years. And I'm
Mm,
hoping to have an English translation soon. It's been a
yeah,
great pleasure talking to you, Helen,
yeah, it's fantastic.
and
Thank you so.
connecting after all those years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Alex. And for everyone listening, if there's any feedback, we love to hear from you. I'm on X, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on LinkedIn, all of these places, or of course, old-fashioned email, helen@blondemoney.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your time, Alex.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.